The subject of today's video had all the odds stacked against him. He was never given a fair chance in recruiting and was told he could never become a star running back. At only 5'6", his chances were pretty much zero at becoming a star running back or ever going to the NFL. Instead of letting that get to his head though, he has now turned into one of the best running backs in college football, is a 3-year starter, and will more than likely have a future on Sundays. Today we're going to tell the inspiring story of Deuce Vaughn, go through his crazy recruiting process, his time at Kansas State, and what we can expect for him in the future. But before we get started, we're on the road to 100K, so quickly be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like if you want to support today's video, turn on notifications, and let me know what player, topic, team, or situation I should cover next. Now though, let's get started and talk about the crazy story of Deuce Vaughn. Before Vaughn was compared to the likes of Darren Sproles, he grew up in a football setting as his father was a former assistant at Arkansas, Ole Miss, Memphis, and Texas, so he knew what it would take for his son to play college football. This was a double-edged sword though, as he spent all his time recruiting and never at home with Deuce. It was very tough for him, and when his father was on the Ole Miss staff, he got in trouble, and that was the end of his coaching career. That is when the whole Ole Miss program went under fire with Hugh Freeze, so when he got back, he got to spend more time with him. But going further back in time, Deuce would move around a lot as a kid and played both soccer and flag football. Things would change later though. When the Vaughns moved from Memphis to Austin in 2014, his parents finally let him start playing tackle football. Even then, the tiny kid with the big helmet knew how to make people miss. He was seen as a great player in his area, but there was one problem: he was short. In 9th grade, Deuce was so far behind, his parents actually had one request. Before doctor's visits, his parents would call ahead and make a request and say please don't bring up his height. It's not that their son was self-conscious about it, they were just being overprotective, and his friends were all growing taller and he wasn't. At 5'5", Vaughn was done growing in 9th grade, and his odds of becoming a big-time football player were low. How did he respond? Well, he got to work and kept a good attitude. Deuce couldn't change his height, but he could control how hard he worked. He'd have to be the most prepared, most versatile, and toughest player just to have a chance, and Deuce would take that to heart. He said, quote, "People are always like, man, if you were just 5 inches taller, you'd be in Alabama. I don't want to be 5 inches taller, I don't want to be 5'10", he would say. This is exactly who I want to be, and I've always been able to make this my superpower. When Deuce would arrive at Cedar Ridge High School, he played both football and basketball, but a moment during one game determined his fate. He said, quote, "I'll never forget, it was the second to last game of the season. I go up for a layup, and some dude who's like 6'5" just takes it off the glass, and I was like, this is where my basketball career ends. I'm gonna go ahead and hang up my shoes and grab some cleats." He was good enough to play varsity as a true freshman, but the staff was worried he was too small and too short to play. They waited until the playoffs for his call-up and sent him in during a blowout win. His first carry was a 70-yard touchdown. That's when Deuce knew he was the real deal. He'd make the right choice picking football over basketball, as he had an incredible career, going for 5,472 all-purpose yards, and as a senior, he broke the single-season school record for rushing yards with 1,940, including 406 yards in one game. The guy was insane and pretty much unstoppable. But when college recruiters would visit Cedar Ridge, they would politely nod and change the subject. His head coach said, quote, "You had a lot of college coaches that seemed like they had made up their mind about him before they ever came. They'd be like, yeah, he's really good, his highlights are really good," and then they'd start talking about some other kid. Vaughn went to Texas A&M, Texas, and Baylor camps, but it never made a difference. Fortunately, his father had 17 years of experience in recruiting, and that would help. Eventually, his dad's connections would pay off, as the first 3 schools that offered Deuce were USF, Missouri, and Arkansas. Those came from assistants who had worked with his dad, and guys who had watched Deuce grow up and knew his intangibles. Those were solid, but the Kansas State offer was different. K-State running backs coach Brian Anderson was actually very reluctant at first, but after he brought it to the staff for evaluation, it changed everything. The staff was eventually impressed, but the head man would have to sign off in front of it first. How much film did Chris Kleiman have to watch to make up his mind? He said, quote, "About 4 snaps. We said, okay, that kid can play in the Big 12 and be an impact guy." Then you have one conversation with him and you say, okay, he has the it factor. He's mature beyond his years, he's got his priorities in check, and he loves the game of football. You can just tell watching the kid play how much he loves to play, so it did not take long for us to decide that he would be an exceptional football player. While Kansas State knew they were getting a gem, recruiting sites weren't really that high on him. According to 24/7 Sports, Vaughn was a 3-star recruit, the number 16 all-purpose back, and the 1,235th best player in the class of 2020. So how would an undersized and under-recruited player do in the Little Apple? When he would arrive in Manhattan, he'd be competing with Tyler Burns and Harry Trotter for the starting job, but there was a real chance he could play right away. Right before the season started, a Kansas State linebacker had this to say about Deuce. Quote, "When we see him in the backfield, I know me and Elijah talk to each other and say deuce, deuce, deuce. We point him out every time he's on the field because we know he's getting the ball or they're setting him up to get the ball, so we just try to contain him and let the defensive ends know so they can contain and keep him in the box." As a true freshman, this guy was already a major priority, and he would break out into the college football scene pretty early on. In his first career game against Arkansas State, Vaughn would rush the ball 12 times for 47 yards in his first career touchdown. Unfortunately, they lose to Arkansas State, but the following week, he'd have a touchdown and over 100 yards receiving in a win over number 3 Oklahoma. This put him onto the scene, and then he had 2 touchdowns and a win over Texas Tech and helped them beat TCU. He then had another score against Kansas, and Kansas State started out with a 4-1 record. Vaughn was a mixed bag for the remainder of the year, as he didn't do a whole lot against West Virginia, Oklahoma State, and Iowa State, but would have over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns against Baylor, and 125 yards and 2 touchdowns against Texas. Vaughn went over the 100-yard mark 3 different times, and as a true freshman, he'd run the ball for 642 yards with 7 touchdowns and 25 catches for 434 yards and 2 scores there. He's one of the best young freshmen in the country, and for a guy at only 5'6", was doing pretty dang well. He became the Big 12 Freshman of the Year and was the second team All Big 12 selection. Going into 2021, he was going to have a ton of hype. He would definitely deliver, as he'd go for 124 yards and a touchdown in their Week 1 win over Stanford, and then had over 100 yards and 3 touchdowns in a win over Southern Illinois. He'd once again break the century mark against Nevada, before he'd have an insane performance against Oklahoma. He caught 10 passes for 104 yards and a score there, and they almost upset them for the second straight season. 2 weeks later, he had 3 touchdowns against Texas Tech, and then had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns against TCU. He had a career day against Kansas, as he ran for 162 yards and 3 touchdowns, and then had over 100 yards and a score against West Virginia. The guy had scored in all but 1 game so far this year, and he continued on with a great finish. He had over 100 yards and a touchdown against Baylor, and then 143 yards and a touchdown against Texas. K-State had a good season, and they'd end up going to the Texas Bowl, where they'd play against LSU. He'd have the best performance of his career, as he'd have 146 yards and 3 scores on the ground, and a touchdown through the air. Vaughn was absolutely insane. He ran for 1,404 yards and 18 touchdowns on the ground, and then had nearly 500 yards receiving with 4 touchdowns there. Vaughn ended up becoming a consensus All-American, a second-team All-Big 12 selection, and according to PFF, no one had a higher rushing grade than Vaughn last year, as he had a 93.2 score. He said, quote, "I've never been the biggest kid on the football field, but being the smallest guy on the field, I had to tell myself you can either dwell on the fact that you're small, or you can use it to your advantage, and that's exactly what I try to do every time I step on the field." He turned his negative into a positive, and was now starting to appear on 2023 NFL mock drafts. Right now he is seen as a consensus 4th round pick, and people are comparing him to Darren Sproles. He obviously went to Kansas State and was also undersized, so it's probably a good comparison. But how has Vaughn done this year? Well, he went for over 100 yards and a touchdown against South Dakota State, had 145 yards and 2 touchdowns against Missouri, and then since then has also played well. He went for over 100 yards and a win over Oklahoma, had 170 yards against Texas Tech, and had 80 yards in a loss to Tulane. This past weekend, he had probably the worst performance of his career against Iowa State, but so far, Vaughn is having a great season. He's ran for 661 yards and 3 touchdowns, and is on his way to becoming an all-conference player once again. Despite his height, and despite having 2 years of film on him, defenses still can't seem to stop him, and I don't think they will. This guy has the heart of a lion, and has one of the most inspiring stories in the game. I find myself rooting for Vaughn, and I really hope he's going to make it at the next level. While he is only 5'6", I still think a team will take a chance on him, and he's going to find a way to stick around in the league for a while. This guy is just built different, and I'm definitely curious to see how he's going to do. But what do you think? If you're a Kansas State fan, what do you think of Deuce Vaughn? Who is another player I could take a look at in my next video? And what player, team, topic, situation, or anything should I do next? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.